Hey, it's Bill Tenny-Brittian with the Effective Church Group and instructor at Phillips Seminary for the Center for Ministry and Lay Training. Thank you for joining me. This is our third lecture in Proclamation of the Word. We're talking about preaching with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. Probably today we'd say the Bible in one hand and Google News in the other. I don't know, or Instagram or wherever you get your news. That saying, preaching with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other, comes from a guy named Karl Barth, who was a Swiss theologian. He was one of the most contemporary, one of our more contemporary, big-time theologians, and wrote a lot of stuff and was very, very popular back in the day, in the 20th century, probably one of the leading theologians of the 20th century. And he got it. He understood that if we as a church was going to be relevant to the rest of the world, we were going to have to understand the rest of the world. So what I'm really talking about today is how to craft a sermon that's both relevant and has value to those who you're trying to speak to, and especially since preaching is not just for the redeemed, but also for those who are outside the church, outside the kingdom, outside of Christianity. How do we create a sermon that's relevant and has value to them as well? Let me be real clear here. Most sermons, they're addressing questions that people just aren't asking. We talk about the Reformation. We talk about the Trinity. We talk about atonement. We talk about Epiphany. We talk about Lent. All these things, they're addressing questions and issues that the vast majority of people in our culture just aren't asking. They're not interested in. They're like, yeah, and not relevant to me. Not relevant at all. So why would I come listen to what you had to say about any of those topics? Because I don't care. I know. They should care, right? Yeah, that's our perspective that we project on them. They don't care. And we can keep doing what we've always been doing, which is getting us the results we're getting. How's your church? Is it growing like a weed, really just taking off, lots of visitors and people staying and getting baptized and all that? Or we can say, maybe what we're doing isn't working, but perhaps we ought to do something differently. And your sermon is one of the few places where you have really good control over what's going on in your church, if you're the pastor, or if you're going to be a pastor. So the question I think we need to start off by asking is, what topics are people wrestling with? What are the things that they would say, oh, wow, I've got to come hear that sermon. I've got to go show up to hear about that. So what topics are they? Well, the question is, how would you know? Here's part of the problem, is that you and I are church people. We do church. We do church a lot. We think like church people think, which is to say, we don't think like unchurched people think. Projection, trying to think, well, what are they worried about? That really doesn't work, because you can't think like an unchurched person. Not anymore. I teach evangelism and preaching and pastoral leadership for Phillips. In my evangelism class, I have an assignment that I do every year. So if you haven't taken the evangelism class, hey, heads up, this is coming. If you have, you'll remember this one. I asked the class, what are the top things that you think keep the culture, the people out in your community, what keeps them up at night? What's their biggest concern? And I have them write down their top three things. What are three things you really think they're wrestling with? And then I send them out in the community to actually have conversations with people who are not in church, preferably people who have no church experience or almost no church experience. And generally speaking, the majority of the class are absolutely surprised at the lack of spirituality level of the questions, because they projected thinking, well, what they're worried about is, does God really love me? Does God accept me? Does God judge me? Am I going to be acceptable to God? Am I going to go to heaven or hell? Or those questions don't get asked. The questions that people are wrestling with are, how do I save my marriage? How do I keep my marriage fresh? How do I deal with my kids? They're kind of out of control. What about my career, finances? That the students so often say, I'm just so surprised at their lack of interest in the things of spirituality. But I got a hint for you. Every one of those topics is a spiritual issue. Your relationships, that's a spiritual issue. Your career choice and your career path, spiritual issues. Your family, spiritual issues. Your finances, spiritual issues. What you do when you open the fridge for a snack is a spiritual issue. Everything in life is a spiritual issue on some level. But we're preaching about the Trinity and Lent and, Reformation Sunday. If you really want to see the biblical model of preaching, just open the Bible. When we see Jesus preaching, when we see those in the book of Acts preaching, and those should be the models, right? What do they deal with? The crowd's biggest concerns. Let me tell you what they're not dealing with and what they didn't deal with. They didn't deal with systemic issues. Not one time are you going to find Jesus or the early church addressing slavery, racism, the role of women, and that was a big issue in those days, the occupation of the Romans. They just didn't deal with that stuff. They didn't deal with the 1% or the rich versus the poor, or they didn't deal with global issues. They just didn't. And they also didn't deal with the sins of the community. You know how the community is failing society. They didn't deal with any of those issues when they addressed the people. They stuck with individual issues. They understood, long before radio was around, they understood that WIIFM is the radio station everybody's tuned into. That's what's in it for me. When Jesus preached to his congregation, he was 100% relevant to where they were and what they were needing. You see, the key to great preaching is always relevance and value. Does it apply to me? And does it help me in some way? There's a saying I picked up along the way that when it comes to relevant, valuable preaching, in other words, preaching that is transforming lives, that those who are outside the church and inside the church are interested in hearing, is that every Sunday solves a problem. Every Sunday solves a problem. Hence the saying, the newspaper in one hand, the Bible in the other metaphor. You start with where they are, not with where you are, or where your congregation is, or where you think they ought to be. Now, having said that, then there's Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs, founder of Apple, you know that guy? He once made a comment about his innovative products that he released. He said, the public will know what they want when I show them what they want. And he was right. It's a paradox. He could figure out what they wanted. Now, that's an amazing thing, and that's a paradox. And the paradox is that we have something to offer that people don't want, but we have something to offer them that people desperately want. But let me ask you a question. Why would anyone who's not a Christian, okay, just think that. Why would anyone who's not a Christian, why would they want to be a Christian? Why would anyone want to come to church? Why would anyone want to come to your church? What are you offering them, really? I mean, just for a moment, in your picture your mind, you're standing in your congregation Sunday morning, look around the crowd, look at church members, look at them, you know who they are. Would an unchurched person want to trade their lives with anyone in your congregation? Probably not. And that's why your sermon has to inspire and motivate transformation. Do you think the crowds in Jesus' day saw the kingdom of God in the religion of their day? They went to the temple and the synagogue, and they were pretty apathetic about it. I mean, they went through the rites and rituals, but the Jewish people, by and large, weren't out there proselytizing, bringing new people in. They just didn't. They looked at the church, the religion of the day, and go, yeah, whatever. In fact, a lot of Jesus' preaching, especially when he addressed the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the religious leaders of his day, he dealt with that issue. Guys, he said, you're just not getting it. You're missing the boat here. You're making things more burdensome. You're making it harder on people. You're not showing the way of the Lord. So when the average person looked around at the religious venue, they go, yeah, whatever, not interested. Didn't see the kingdom of God, whatever. And yet Jesus painted a vision about the kingdom of God and what church, religion, could be. And that's a part of your task. Because if you don't paint a what could be, why would anyone want to be a part of it? So that being the case, if you're going to reach people outside the church and truly people inside your church, your sermon has to, number one, it has to be relevant. And what I mean by that, it has to scratch an itch that's actually itching. It has to be something that people are concerned about. Relevant says it matters to me in some way. Lent doesn't matter to anybody. I'm sorry, I'm not saying you don't do Lent, okay? But I'm just saying that no one out there is going, Lent, oh man, I've just got to get into that. They're not. Sacrifice, yeah, okay, for a purpose or a cause, but sacrifice for the sake of sacrifice, yeah, don't sign me up. Yes, I know, we want to relate to Jesus' suffering and all that. That's great. I understand. It's a great spiritual practice. No one's come to your sermons to hear about it, except for your long-term Christians who come every week anyway. And to be fair, it's probably not relevant to them either. There's no scratch there. There's no itch that needs to be scratched, I should say. It's not relevant. Relevant says, this is something that matters to my life. Relevant in my life now. So it has to do with, again, a sermon on my marriage would be relevant if I'm married. If I was single, it wouldn't. So you see, every sermon would be relevant to some and not relevant to others, which means you're going to have to move around, because a sermon that is universally available to everyone is universally uninspiring. Oh, we should really love everybody. Well, that's nice. No argument. I want world peace. Every beauty queen that stepped on the stage with the microphone, oh, I want world peace. Yeah, we all do. But that's a nice dream. Not going to happen until the second coming, all right? Relevant, something that matters to my life today. But it also has to be valuable. Just because it's about my marriage doesn't mean that your sermon's about my marriage, doesn't mean that it's going to be a valuable sermon for me. To be valuable, it has to actually scratch that itch. Your sermon has to actually deal with that issue. There's a lot of value in being valuable. Let me put it this way. Everyone who wanted to be in church last week, they were in church last week. Now, I know that's not 100% true. There were a few people who really would have loved to be at church, but they were sick or they were incarcerated. But in the bell curve thing, anyone who wanted to go to church last week, they were in church last week, which means that the majority of people in America, about 85%, actually about 86%, they chose specifically not to come to your church or any other church. Why weren't they there? The number one reason, and they do this survey all the time, why don't you go to church? Well, too many hypocrites, the real reasons is it's not relevant and they don't find it to be valuable. It's not relevant, it doesn't apply to me, and it's not valuable, it doesn't help me. It doesn't give me anything. You see, most sermons have little value to offer because what are you offering? No one pretty much in your community believes they're going to hell. Nobody. And nobody believes that the Bible is true on that. Oh yeah, the Bible is an old book, and and on top of that, it's a Christian's book, and I don't really believe in hell. And if it's a loving God wouldn't send someone to hell. I'm really working really hard on my life. I'm trying to make a good life, and no, I'm not going to hell. No one's worried about that. So your sermons on salvation, which are important when you do them right, when you make them relevant and valuable, but just in the general. Yeah, no one's worried about that. No one's showing up at your church going, oh, I just got to hear a sermon on how I can escape the fires of hell. The lack of value in your sermon and in the church overall is really the reason why people don't go to church. It's why even your church parents take their kids to soccer practice on Sundays and Wednesdays, because they believe their kids get more value from soccer than they get from Sunday school. I mean, let's be honest. That we have Sunday school with the flannel boards and the coloring sheets, and kindergartners are given iPads when they start school. But the church, we're still back in the Crayola days. It's soccer practice is teaching the kids, well, they get them physically fit. It's teaching them leadership skills, sportsmanship skills, team building, the need or the people depending on you when you're having to go and show up on a regular basis. And what they learn on Sunday or Wednesday? Moses and the bulrushes, Noah and the ark. And the parents go, let's see, leadership development, Moses and the bulrushes. Which one is my kid going to benefit in life more? Which is why they're not there on Sundays or Wednesdays. They're at soccer practice instead. Because the parents have decided and voted with their feet that what you're offering isn't valuable. And the same goes for the sermons. If your sermon really was valuable to the majority of people out there, and people knew about it, there's a key there, they have to know about it, they'd be there. They have to believe that it was relevant and valuable. You see, you have to prove the value of your sermon every week if you expect guests. And the reality is you need to prove the value of your sermon to the people sitting in the pews. Those who are already there. They're hearing the sermon and they're going, does this matter to me? And most sermons don't. They're nice. I now know the Bible a little better. Great. How has it impacted my life? All right. So valuable. So your sermons to be effective have to be, number one, relevant. Number two, have to be valuable. But you can't stop there. Number three, they have to be inspiring. It has to motivate the application of what you're talking about through a vision of what could be. In other words, you have to show the kingdom of God. You have to show what it would be like if they actually applied the principles of a warm, loving marriage or effective corporate ladder climbing in terms of how do I order my life to make myself valuable at work so they, and all that's biblical. I mean, it's there. How are you inspiring them to take the next step? Which is why I push so hard on this to-do thing. Be more forgiving. That's not an effective to-do. Everyone on this planet knows they should be more forgiving. If you do a sermon on being more forgiving and you say, and your to-do is, we should all be more forgiving, you fail this class. I mean, that's just the bottom line. If you're not asking someone to do something great, and I mean something specifically great, I want you to go home today and I want you to make a list of people who you have wronged or who have wronged you. And I want you to pick one person off that list, and I want you to decide whether having a conversation with them would do more damage or less damage. Would it build a bridge or and find someone on your list that you can build a bridge to. Call them, send them an email, whatever, build a bridge for forgiveness. Now, you see, there's something people can do, and it's a step that will help them learn how to apply the practices. Now, relevance, value, and inspiring, that's a lot on you. That's a lot for your sermon to have to carry. So where do you begin? Well, I want to say you begin with 3 questions. Number 1, and by the way, they're in order of importance. Number 1, the first question you need to ask is, what are the needs of my congregation? Now, if you're the pastor of a church, you should probably already know this, both instinctively and experientially. You'll have had conversations with people. You'll have heard what their needs are in the congregation. And some of those needs are the same needs that people are outside the church. You have people in your church that are married. They would love to have a warmer married life. There are people in your congregation that have kids, adult kids, little kids, grandkids. They want to know more about how to parent them or grandparent them in ways that are helpful. That you have people in your congregation who are struggling with finances, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Some of the needs that they're experiencing are the same needs as those outside. So what are the needs of my congregation? Start there. Then the second question to ask is, what are the needs, what are the concerns of those in my community? Now, too often pastors and laity, they just guess or they project what those concerns are, and they get them wrong almost every time. The only way to know what real life concerns are out there is to spend time with the unchurched in the community, to get to know them, to ask them, to listen, to overhear conversations. You'll hear what's really bothering people if you'll spend time with them. And third, are there regional or national issues that need to be addressed? Now, how do you know if they need to be addressed? Only if they're relevant to the local congregation. Listen, the war in the Ukraine is troubling. And yes, it provides an opportunity for any number of preaching topics. But unless that sermon that you're going to write makes the topic of whatever you're talking about in that war of Ukraine absolutely relevant to the individuals listening, it's better to move that topic to prayer time, and we're going to pray for peace in the world, or not at all. Don't build a sermon around an issue that's not an issue to the people. Better to move that topic, that need, to prayer time, and bring relevance and value to your congregation and to your visitors. Listen, the bottom line is you have to keep up with culture. You need to read books outside your field. You need to watch popular movies and television. Yes, you can be careful about which ones you watch, but if you're not watching and up to date with what your people, the community, are looking at and troubled by, then how are you going to stay current? How are you going to be relevant and be valuable to them? And last is to have conversations and build relationships with those who are outside the church. You cannot be faithful to the Great Commission. You can't write a good sermon that is going to be relevant to your neighbors if you don't know who they are, if you don't know their heart, if you don't have relationships. And then when I talk about that, I'm talking about people you have coffee with, lunch with, people you go home and play, I don't know, parcheesi with, people you just hang out with. Conversations, relationships. That's the best way to get to know the people in your culture. Listen, I hope this has served you. I will see you on the discussion forums.